So on behalf of Sarah, Molly, Vera, Mish, and the Halad team and myself, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of our land in which we work, which is the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne, and acknowledge the Indigenous people of the land of wherever you are joining us from, whether that is on Australian soil or not, and recognise that their connection to the land, the water, and the community. And I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. And the second thing I also wanted to say before we start was just as an indication, if anyone is here is from Melbourne, can you please give us an indication in the chat by just giving us a thumbs up? I just wanted to sort of mention, I'm sure you're all aware that we're about to go into our second lockdown. And so for everyone here in Melbourne, just wanted to say in advance that for the communities that we support over in the Philippines, just as they learnt the news as we did, the first thing they did was to hop online and show that they cared and send a message that we're all safe and well. So I just wanted to pass that forward to everyone from Melbourne. Cool. So let's get started. Welcome to our mini mock series. This is the first one of the 3 mini mocks. And according to our last May cohort that came through, this was one of the best resources for their preparation, and we absolutely love doing it. We love doing a live exam with everyone and being able to share the results straight away. So if you have not yet done a mini mock with us, we're basically about to go into 2 hours of full straight content. So I have put the instructions of how we do the mini mock in the chat. So make sure you do have the chat open at all times, because that's where we submit the links through, and just have that open. So I'm going to let you read those instructions and get ready. And I'm going to give you a bit of a 5-minute intro. And by the time you're ready, can you please just indicate that you're ready to go by typing the word ready in the chat? So just before we begin, in case you have not heard about Halad, we are doing a GAMSAT thing today, but we very much are not a GAMSAT company. And if you are not from Melbourne, you might not have heard of us before, but we very much are a non-for-profit. And guys, Halad just really started off as a project between friends who just wanted to do good, and we were in our last year of university, and we're all studying health degrees, and that's when we sort of went over and connected to a community in rural Philippines who really did need help with health education, and that's where we found as students where we could add value and do something in closing that gap. So we figured out that's what we would do. We just had to come back and figure out how to fund that, and very much here we are literally 1.5 years later running Australia's most affordable GAMSAT service that really does make a social impact. All of our profits go towards funding, providing that free health education overseas in our partner community in Valencia City in Bukidnon, and all the people who provide that free health education are very much our volunteers. And as you can see in the picture here, that's Gabby, who's actually one of our tutors as well and has volunteered with us over in the Philippines. And so it's crazy, I think, to say that just our May cohort that came through a few months ago, we had about 150 or so students come through our GAMSAT thing. And it's insane to say that they raised around $10,000 or something like that for the cause. So I just want to say before we start, thank you so much for not just attending our event, but very much supporting our cause, especially in these early days. It's very much because of the people in the early days of starting anything that makes a world of difference. So we always extend that thanks to our students, and you know, it's very much because of that May GAMSAT cohort that we're able to do what we do now. And so all we can do is pay it forward and hopefully make a better experience for you guys in September. So very much we're you know, the reason why I say sort of the mini mock has been one of the best experiences is always the feedback that comes back is because of the tutors that were helping them throughout the next 2 hours, which you're going to experience. And I can say for myself, if you have not met me yet, I'm Eliza, the co-founder and managing director here at Halad, which very much means that I just get to work with very smart people. I'm not one of the very smart people. So please don't ask me a GAMSAT question. I will not be able to give you an answer to that. But today I'm just going to be manning the tech and the chat behind all of this, and making sure that it all runs smoothly and you get your links to the mock exam. Sarah is our head of GAMSAT, is also a section 1 and 2 tutor and an MD3 at Monash, and she is very much the brains behind Halad's GAMSAT and oversees literally all the programs. And I say this every time, but honestly, I've never met someone who will want to get you into med more than Sarah. She is someone who goes above and beyond for each and every student and makes sure that everyone's kept accountable. And Vera and Molly, Molly, if you give a wave. So Vera and Molly are not sisters. We get this all the time. But Vera and Molly have actually come through our May GAMSAT sitting and have done GAMSATs before offline, and now done, we call them our guinea pigs because they did the first online one and had to go through that and experience that. And they have done extremely well on their GAMSAT and are now part of our GAMSAT tutoring team. And they'll be facilitating you in section 2 and doing some of the marking behind the scenes whilst you guys are submitting your responses. And we have Mish, who's our section 3 tutor, who very much specializes in bio. Hey Mish. And he's an MD1 at Melbourne University, and I have never met someone who is kinder and nicer than Mish. So before I hand over to the team who is going to facilitate the mock exam in just a bit, always have put this slide in here, and if you're going to come to all 3 of the mini mocks, I'm going to remind you each and every single mini mock beforehand, is that now that we've gone through a whole season with a cohort of GAMSAT students, we've realized the reason why that they're scoring and improving 10, 20 points at a time is literally because of this one philosophy that we teach at the start of everything, and we are always going to remind you of it, and that is very much that to have the bigger picture in mind when you're answering questions, when you are trying to decipher between those last 2 options, is to have the bigger picture and get into the mindset of what it would be like in a scenario like that if you were a doctor, and how would they think. And so we don't mentor students who just want to have incredible GAMSAT scores. We mentor students who want to become incredible medical professionals. And now that we've been through a season with so many students, there truly is a difference between those 2 things. And I add this screenshot in every time, and I think Sarah tries to take it out every time, but I'm going to leave it in there because yes, it's a homage to her, but also I think it definitely speaks to that bigger picture thinking. And this student has said, I feel like I learned from more than just techniques for the exam, but also a new way of thinking and of conversing with people. Whenever I receive corrections from you at 2 a.m.s, I still don't know how that happens. And when I talk to you about medicine, I sense a level of commitment and passion you have. And from this, I see the kind of energy which is required from a doctor. Thanks for allowing us to get to know you. Even though I won't miss GAMSAT preparations, I will miss your lessons. I think that just speaks to the bigger thing of getting into the right mindset before entering this exam. It's not just ticking boxes and circling A, B, C, D. There really is a thought process behind it, and that's very much what all of our tutors try to instill, and what we're trying to instill in this mini mock too. So as we move forward, just a quick walkthrough. You would have had this in the event description already. Section 1, we're going to start off with that first. We're just going to go linear down the page. 15 minutes, you're going to get to answer questions. Sarah's going to have the timer on. Please mute yourself, but have your headphones in so you can hear when the timer runs out. You will have to press submit at the end of those 15 minutes. I will collate all of your results at the back end, and then while Sarah's explaining some of those difficult questions and showing you the distribution of how everyone went, I'll be tallying up all the scores and putting that back into the chat, and you'll be able to see that live. Then we'll go straight into section 2. You'll have to answer 1 prompt. Clarification, Sarah, in 20 minutes, how much of the written response do you want them to write?
If you can, at the very least, an introduction and a body paragraph. You can either choose to then round it off with some form of a conclusion or add another paragraph. Okay,
cool, terrific. So that's what you're trying to aim for in 20 minutes. Take a note for yourself because I will forget. And so in the back, they're also on the submission form to that. At the very end, there's a question that says, are you happy for this to be shared anonymously live. And so essentially, if you tick yes, we'll be selecting out of a pile of those questions to be displaying to give sample feedback from Sarah live. So we'll be aiming to read through one student's sample essay. And then we'll go straight into section 3, where we'll hand over to Mish. You'll have 20 minutes to sit 10 questions. There are 2 stems, and then Mish will take 15 minutes to sort of go through those explanations, and again, we'll show you those live results. So, cool. If everyone's ready, I'm going to stop screen sharing. Cool. Looks like everyone is sort of ready.
Also, Laz, I think you might need to post those instructions in again, just for anyone who came in after you sent them.
Cool. Terrific.
Yeah. Awesome.
Oh, sorry. Copy the wrong thing, but...
But you also need those, so that's good.
Okay, so I've just put in the links to the question and the answer booklet. I suggest that you open the question and the answer side by side. I'm about to put the instructions in again. And then Sarah, if you can start the timer.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. So just whilst Live sends that through, I'll set up the screen share. Yep. And exactly like she said, I'll give you 15 minutes. I'll let you know when there's a minute to go. And then afterwards, we'll work through some of the questions, and definitely feel free to put any questions you might have in the chat. All right, if we could just get a couple of thumbs up, you can just press the thumbs up icon just to check that you're ready, that you're on the question document. Fantastic.
All right, let's start the timer.
All right, let's start. All right, cool. All right, great. That's time. So I'll just give you a moment to click submit, and I'm going to switch my screen share. And just while you're finishing submitting, just a little bit of context. So we've used or sourced these questions from some of the mock exams that we provided in May, and I deliberately chose questions that were challenging or more difficult. So what I tell my students always is that I would rather you make mistakes now and feel like you're not doing well, and then develop techniques around that. So I don't want anyone to feel bad or anything like that, regardless of your score. That's not the part that's important here. And also I'm going to share this. So this screen here on the left is how you guys responded. And then this screen here on the right, it's an answer set that we'll send out to you tonight after the session as well. But it has answers, and it also has the distribution from our May sitting, so you can compare that as well. So what I'm going to do is just have a quick look. So here you can sort of see which questions people struggled with most. So what I'd like to do, you're more than welcome as well to put questions that you might have in the chat, but I want to go over sort of some techniques and introduce you to each of the stems and sort of key things that I would pull out to help me with answering the questions. And with that, we'll go over a couple of the questions that people found the most challenging. And like I mentioned, you'll get this document later, so don't stress if you feel like you missed something. You'll get a chance to read over it after. Great. So I'm just going to start with the first one. So the first one being a poem. If you are a first-time GAMSAT sitter or haven't seen a lot of GAMSAT material yet, poetry is a very common part or common stimulus to come up in section 1. My key tip with poetry is to work out what the overall message is. So what's it about? What's the point of the poem? Which can be hard sometimes because poems use a lot of literary conventions which aren't always in those longer passages. It can use a lot of imagery or metaphors and different styles of language that you might feel less comfortable with. This poem has a metaphor in it which is quite significant, the fool's gold metaphor throughout it. However, it's a little bit better in terms of it doesn't have any Old English or Shakespearean language. So whilst this poem doesn't have that, you can expect that's something that could come up in section 1. So when I'm reading the poem, we've already got a little bit of a hint here with Fool's Gold that has something to do with the poem. So I would be trying to work out, why is this the name of the poem? That's definitely something to think about as you're reading it. And the other thing as I go along is what's happening. So what's the main message? What's the point of this? I like to do that before I even touch any of the questions. Some students will prefer to read the questions first before doing that. It doesn't really matter either way, but you do need to discover what works for you first, so that you can feel confident whenever you approach a text, no matter how unfamiliar it might be to you. So in this case, as the poem progresses, there's a lot of hints about what's going on. So firstly, we can sort of tell that it's someone's sort of reflection or story or narrative. They're talking about what they did this morning. They talk about the things that they love. So we get a lot of hints there. Also, as you go further down, they start to list fairly typical parts of someone's life or day. So someone's, a lady's pit bull wagging their tail. So like a really common, see a dog during the day. Nothing super crazy or exciting, but it's something a lot of people enjoy. Bitcoin extortation, that was probably something in the news at the time. Making eye contact with people. So as you go along, what you can see is that this guy has written a poem about a typical day. So it's sort of like one of those day in the life. And so then the trick is to work out, well, what's this fool's gold that's being talked about? What's the whole point of the poem? What's the message? What's the deal with this stapler? And the deal is that all of these little components of this person's day, so playing Tetris or putting that penny in the mall fountain here, they all form or compile together to form this person's life. However, it turns out that life, even though it might seem fun and enjoyable to you, when you put it down on paper, sometimes it's just a lot of small things which from the outside can appear pretty insignificant to the rest of the world. But to you, they're still important. So now that you've oriented yourself to the poem, you should be able to answer the questions with a lot more ease than just trying to pull out little parts of it and try and make sense of tiny components of the poem. So for example, in question 1, which I might just... Yeah, which half of you got correct, which is great. And the other really common option for question 1 is B, choosing between whether it's in pursuit of something unattainable or whether it's whether life experiences aren't as golden or amazing as they seem on paper, is working out that poem, looking at the tone and going, okay, the reason why this person's telling us about the gold stapler and the fool's gold is more to do with the fact that these life experiences are actually pretty small. They're nothing grand or amazing. And so then it can lean more towards C, because the author has had things happen that are attainable. It just turns out that they're not as big or exciting as maybe they felt at the time. And then in this explanation here, it goes a little bit into fool's gold, just in case you don't know what it is. Other questions, how many were there for this one? 4. Let's have a look at the ones people struggled with most. So probably 3 and 4. So with question 3, we had a little bit of a range between A, C, and D, as you can see here. So this hot car effect, this is a really funny part of the poem, I find. I'm just going to scroll back up to it for a second. So here he's hopping in what seems like the seat of his car, and then is sort of reflecting on, the car sort of that when it's a hot day and the sun's been beating down, the car feels like a bit of an oven inside, and is reflecting on, the hot car effect, that's what can be used to explain what global warming is like on the earth, and we explain it to senators and kids. So I think that's a very typical thing that we as humans do, is we sort of reflect on random concepts throughout our day. So I found that quite relatable. But in terms of what it was used to mean, probably the 2 to choose between would be C and D. And whilst it is also a jab at senators. It's less at their lack of education and more that sometimes we see our political powers as a bit of like idiots and we look at them as being inadept. And so that way we dumb things down, as opposed to actually the hot car effect in a broader sense in the poem being presented as a layman's term, which is used not only for senators but also for young kids who might not have the vocabulary or might need to have things explained to them in a different way. And then just in terms of question 4, this one definitely a hard one. This is a very typical question to find in the GAMSAT just across the board, is to match things up, and they'll have 2 words and you have to sort of pick the option that has both words that resonate. So it's really easy to pick one of the words and go, yes, this one matches really well. So with option C, for example, insignificant does match pretty well. He's remembering playing Tetris. He's remembering throwing pennies in the fountain, a dog, really small parts of someone's day. But I wouldn't say that those things are mundane, because to him, those things are quite enjoyable. And those are sort of those things that we would say are like the spice or the joy of life. So seeing a dog isn't really mundane and more gives you a little smile and you're like, oh yeah, and it brightens your day. And so that's why I lean away from mundane or away from option C because of that word in there. As opposed to A, resonates quite strongly because unadorned matches the idea that none of these are particularly special events, but to the author, as he writes about them, they're quite nostalgic. And so, looking back on, those fun things that he did, and he's like, you know what, they might not be grand, but they made up my day, and they're still going down on the paper and getting stapled together, and ta-da, that's my day. So hopefully that helps a little bit with approaching the poem, approaching the text in general, and how to start thinking through some of the questions and answering those questions. All right, we're going to shift gears a tiny bit. It looks like you guys did really well with the cartoon, which is good. But exactly the same method, even though it's a completely different type of text, this is a visual text, I'd still take time, even if you'd prefer to read the questions first, that's fine. Still take time to look at it, analyze it, work out what's going on. So in this case, I look at this text and I go, well, what's happening? Is it a serious text? Sort of, but not really. We know that there's a little bit of jest going on here. They're having a little bit of a laugh about a common, the 2 wrongs don't make a right. But then they're actually using like crazy smart maths to prove that it actually can. And so there's like a little bit of a joke tucked in there amongst the intelligence, and sort of, I guess you would put it together as being a lot of wit. So a little bit of a variation in the type of humor. I would recommend going away and looking up classical types of cartoon style humor. I don't often tell students to go away and like research different things or types of poems or whatever, because I don't think it's helpful. But being familiar with classic styles of humor, such as knowing what irony is, knowing what satire is, and knowing the difference between them, knowing the difference between when sarcasm is being used or wordplay, just knowing sort of your basic humor styles and when they're likely to crop up. And so irony is really common. It's particularly used when there's something that's been given to show that there's the opposite going on for the emphasis of humor. So in this case, they're showing, okay, well, this maths equation shows that wrongs actually do make a right, but in our societal setting, we don't agree with that. And so it's this idea of the opposite being portrayed for jest or for humor. So my suggestion there would be just go and become familiar with some of those more common humor types that come up with cartoons. But definitely no need, I get this question a lot from students, definitely no need to go and learn political cartoons or learn about a lot of political events to understand these. As you can see, this cartoon should be universally understandable, as opposed to having to understand a cartoon about a particular political leader. All right, I'm going to jump to, question 6. This one is, again, one of those classic ones with 2 words that you have to find both match. And so, for example, I would say that scientific matches, but frivolous doesn't match quite as much. Even though there's a bit of jest, it's still quite a restrained jest, and it's within their limits of, they're not going crazy or being silly. They're just like, oh, look at this equation, and I guess we can apply it to this equation. And similar, it's a little bit clinical, but it's not overly profound. In fact, it's more that they're using their intellect. So their scientific is very similar to, it is intellectual, and then they're applying a bit of wit, and they're just having a bit of, I guess, banter would be the modern term that we like to use, having a bit of banter with each other. So I find it helpful, even though this cartoon might not feel very relatable to you, because I mean, I don't relate to being a mathematician, and I don't think I ever will, but there's definitely still relatable elements in there. So I'd highly recommend trying to make the cartoon, or even the poem, the text, whatever, relatable to you. All right. And then, looks like you guys did really well on this last one. We might just tackle question 10. This is really common. Sorry, there's just someone in the waiting room I'm going to let in. Great. Yeah, okay. And actually, just quickly, I'll answer this question in the chat. Definitely expressions in the text are really helpful, including in a visual text. I would always be looking at facial expressions for two main reasons. Firstly, for like a tone and how people are feeling. And secondly, to check who's speaking. So if one person's mouth is open, or they look like they're speaking, then they're more likely to be the ones that's speaking. In this case, it doesn't really matter who is, because both characters are portrayed as having an equal role or an equal profession, but in others it might be really important and helpful to know that. Yeah. So this kind of text also very common to get different passages and have to compare and contrast them. You guys all were able to work out. Oh, yep, no worries. I'm being reminded to read the question out loud for students who are watching the recording. Sorry to anyone watching the recording who didn't know what was going on for the past 10 minutes. My apologies. So yes, in terms of Unit 3 here, all about the antidepressants, again, working out what is the commonality between each comment or each sort of passage paragraph. And then the second thing that I would say is really important is work out if you can like summarize each passage or comment into a word or a phrase or a couple of words. So for example, I'd say comment 1 is like exercise over medication. So that's my sort of summary of comment 1. So then when I'm looking at questions, I already know that this comment is the one that's more holistic, more about like a wholesome approach, less about a medical clinical approach. And so then I sort of have oriented myself to each comment, and I also sort of know where to look when I'm looking for different information. So if we drop down to question 10, there we go, we've already answered it for you. Difference between comment 1 and 3. Let's also summarize comment 3 together. So antidepressants are like my store-bought food for neurotransmitters. If you can't make your own, store-bought is a good substitute. This is basically a fancy way of saying people with depression, they don't make the correct neurotransmitters. So if you need to buy them through taking an antidepressant, that's perfectly fine. That's literally what this person's saying. So it looks a little bit sugar coated. It looks like it's holistic because it appears to be all about going out and buying food, but it's not. It's more using this comparison or a simile. If you want to become familiar with words of explaining literary conventions, it's a simile of antidepressants being food, but like neurotransmitter version of food. And so if you jump back down here, it does make sense that A would be correct, because if you remember, comment 1 was the comment that was all about exercise as opposed to medication, whereas comment 3 is still all about medication. Both of them equally agree that there is a possibility to recover. It's just that comment 1 believes that you can recover through physical exercise. So even if you look here, it's the only antidepressant that hasn't made me gain a ton of weight or make me want to jump off a bridge. So this part here implies that the person found that by using exercise as their antidepressant, they felt better. They weren't suicidal anymore. So even though it's subtle, you can still use it to make inferences. And part of section 1, people ask me, when do I make an inference and when do I take something straight from the text? And I would say take it straight from the text if it's physically there. So if the evidence is hard, cold fact right there in front of your face, then you know you can take it. Otherwise, you need to just dig a little bit deeper to work out what was the overall meaning. All right, I'm just going to, all right, let's check. Yeah, great question. More just because they use a simile instead of a metaphor. That's, yeah, thanks, Louise. That's literally it. If it was simile, then it would be correct. So your thinking is correct there, Jacob. It's just simile rather than metaphor. Very subtle difference, and it seems really unfair that ASA would do something like that to you. My suggestion would be just know some literary conventions to know would be similes, metaphors, onomatopoeia, probably like those key poem ones, probably like a year 10 level that you would have learned in school is all that you'd need to know, and you'd be good to go. Great. So I'm just going to check if anyone had any other questions in the chat. Yeah, what line was that? So the question is, just wanted to ask a question about the first poem. What would this line, "I neglected to live," mean? Yes. Yeah. So here it's more talking about that this person is currently realizing that they did things like pretty small things. So, like we were saying, those insignificant things. So, not that they didn't bring this person joy or weren't fun things or parts of life that were important to him, but realizing, oh, hang on, instead of doing big things that could have made a splash, made a difference, I neglected to fully live and make line after line. Just, yeah. Hopefully that makes a little bit more sense. All right, great. So I know that that probably felt like a bit of a whirlwind overview. Yeah. Okay, wait. That, yeah, which matches that underlying tone in question 2 of regret here. Yes, well done. So the comment is, I inferred that to mean they feel regret for their life. Absolutely. So they're like, oh, I didn't live it up. I didn't do all of the things that I could have done. Looking back, I thought life was pretty good and pretty fun. And then looking back, I spent a lot of time playing Tetris and doing those other smaller things. So yeah, there's that sense of regret there. Well done. All right. Yeah, so there's a little bit of techniques, hopefully, that can start you guys off and help you to sort of orient yourselves to the text. Yeah, no worries, Pranitha, you did get it correct. Well done. Awesome. And so I'm just going to, Laz, would you like me to explain this part, or do you want to do it? I don't mind.
I've just consolidated it into like, what's the quiz? I've done the bell curving for them. So you can just look at what you got on the quiz and then what that predicts out to be. And then if you want the really granulated analysis of how we got that, you can click on the spreadsheet. But for everyone at home, we might just want to read out so if you got a quiz score of 2, that's predictive of 37. 3 is equal to 50. 4 is equal to 52. 5 is equal to 56. 6 is equal to 64. And 7 is equal to 69 in this case. And then just asterisks, this was a very small sample size.
That's literally what I was just about to say. Like, the sample size is quite small, and it's more just for your benefit to see a little bit of a comparison with, like, how did other people go on it? Because sometimes it's hard to know, but definitely don't need to take it as this is hard and fast what my GAMSAT score will be. In terms of scores, we might leave a little bit, if we have a bit of time at the end, we might do some of that in the question and answer, if that's okay, because I know that that's a very common question that comes up. Yeah. All right. So we might switch gears a little bit over to section 2. So Liz, if you could put those, fantastic. She's ahead of the game. So just put the links in the chat for you. Just as a reminder, if you came in a little bit late, which is perfectly fine, we'll give you 20 minutes to write something. Preferable if you can write something that has, it's okay if you don't write an exact like essay structure. I don't mind if you write something more creative, but it has the equivalent of at least an introduction and a body paragraph. And if you have time to write another body paragraph and or some sort of concluding component, that would be awesome. And tick if you're happy for us to potentially share it with everyone and give some feedback to it in front of everyone. It's okay if you don't want to, and I'll let you know when you've got a minute to go. All right, just switch. Also, just in case anyone hasn't been familiar with any of this before, the link should have a prompt with 5 quotes. You need to work out what the overarching topic is and write a response to that. All right, and you can start. All right, great. Okay, sorry. Good job, everyone. All right, I'll just give you a moment just to finish submitting. Wow, I struggled to say that word. Okay, and I'm just going to switch my screen share for you all. All right. So what I'm going to do over the next 15 or so minutes is I'm just going to run you all down on section 2 in general and on this prompt, and then some of the back-end team helping out have picked, will pick one of the essays to use as a sample, as an example to give some feedback on. So I just firstly wanted to sort of mention the point of section 2, and also if you're not very familiar with the GAMSAT, there are a lot of resources both by ASA, and we also did a recorded masterclass on the weekend on Saturday with some more information on what all of these sections are about and what you need to do. So if you're not feeling super familiar with it, that's okay. Thanks for still giving it a go, and yeah, hopefully it helped. So section 2, you're required to complete 2 tasks, task A and task B. They both look just like this, so they'll give you 4 to 5 different sort of prompt quotes to form a prompt. So they're usually quotes or they might be ideas. Your task for each one, both task A and task B, is to work out what the overall topic or theme is relating to the prompt. So hopefully by reading through these quotes, you were able to work out that it was around utility, utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. So that sort of concept. A really common mistake that students make is that they read part of a prompt and they think that they can just write on that. So for example, you might have read this part about doctrine and then written a lovely essay all around doctrine and indoctrination, but not actually written about what the overall topic was. So that's a key thing to notice. Or maybe someone else would have written about innocent human beings or murdering people, but not have actually addressed utilitarianism. So between task A and task B, there's a lot of similarities. One of them is that you can literally write in any style you like, as long as you submit something that reflects on the topic or the prompt overall. There are a few differences. Task A tends to be more about things like logic, or about science, about economics, so about sociocultural things, so things that are happening in our community and sort of concepts that are very typical for you to know. Task B tends to be a little bit more emotional and about interpersonal relationships. It can be about things like universal emotions such as love or grief, or it can be about certain experiences. So whilst they might seem like 2 very different tasks, you can get a lot of crossover, and the key really is just to write what you can about the topic relating to the prompt. So that's sort of the task as a whole. In terms of approaching this task, so we just gave you one of them today, and in our next mini mock, we'll probably, I think we're alternating, we'll give you a task B. So you can come along to that if you haven't seen a task B version or example before. But in a few key things that I look for when I look for a good piece of writing, I like to see a student who's able to write with some form of opinion or idea on it. So whenever I work out what the overarching theme or prompt or topic is of the prompt, so in this case, I'm already at the stage where I know that it's about utilitarianism, then I take a step back and ask myself, what do I think about that? Or I might ask myself, what do I want to say about that? So what's the number one thing that after someone read my piece, I would want them to know that I was thinking? And so if I haven't hit that in my piece, then I haven't quite hit the mark of what I wanted to achieve. So the task is called written communication. And the reason why is because exactly as it says, the idea is that you can communicate in writing what your thoughts are. So if you're able to communicate what you think about utilitarianism, then you've hit the brief. Something else that I look for is complexity. If I'm reading heaps and heaps of pieces, I want to see something that's unique, and whether that's by you writing in a unique style, whether that's by you delving into something you're quite passionate about. So maybe you're really passionate about economics, so you talk about utilitarianism in an economic realm, or maybe you're really passionate about human nature, so you talk about selfishness in the context of utilitarianism. So make it your own, make it something you're passionate about. That's more likely to be high scoring than writing something really generic. So even though when I first think about utilitarianism, I think of that classic trolley problem. Do you save the 5 people by switching the train trolley, or do you kill the one? Or do you kill the 5 and save the 1 by letting it run its course? Whilst that's sort of the first thing that comes to my mind, I think that's something a lot of people might think about. And so that's something I'd probably go, well, if I do still want to write about that, I'd need to delve into something a little bit more complex as I go. So there's just sort of a few things that I like to think about as I go, to ask myself, am I writing something that's interesting, that's complex, that shows what I'm interested in, and that responds to it? And then at the end, I like to see something that can sort of wrap it all together and make a final statement that's thought-provoking and goes, this is what I really believe about this topic. So there are tons of different ways that you can approach this task, and sometimes people think you have to follow a set structure. Whilst it's completely fine, you won't be marked down if you just follow a generic essay structure, and it's safe and it means you can write well. You definitely don't have to, especially if that's not something you like to do. So my recommendation would be to practice and see what kinds of styles help you to best approach this task, and what kinds of styles help you to write something that's really good and cohesive. Okay, so we've just got a question. Do you think the number of paragraphs makes a difference in the mark? Would a 3-body paragraph essay be looked upon more favorably over a 2-body paragraph one if they had the same number of words, that is? Yeah, great question. On length, absolutely does not matter. I'm more concerned about what you have to say than how you say it or how you structure it. So if you have something amazing to say and you can put it in 2 paragraphs, I would rather that than you rambling on and just adding another paragraph for the sake of it. When it's concerning is when complexity has been left out because you didn't get time to write a 3rd paragraph, or you didn't want to write a 3rd paragraph. But definitely have read fantastic essays which have been shorter. And part of the task is, if you can write concisely with still depth and complexity, then you've really hit the nail on the head, because that's a huge pro to being a good healthcare professional, is being able to summarize things concisely and being able to present things in a really concise and well-structured manner. So absolutely fine to have a shorter piece. All right. And number of words, typically 400 to 500 is perfectly fine. If you do more, that's also fine, but no need to ramble. In fact, I mark down when people ramble. Yes, so 400 to 500 is perfectly fine. All right, so probably shorter than you're used to. And yep, just one more question before we look at a sample. Would you get marked down for not speaking about the overall theme, even though you still spoke about it indirectly? If you do not speak about the overall theme at all, in fact, I might phrase this a little bit better. So whatever you write, whether it's creative or anything else, whether it's creative or whether it's more of a structured essay, you should always have something to say. So you should have a contention or even a message, and that should link back to the theme. If it links back indirectly, it just needs to be clear that there is that link. So it's fine if you pick something a little bit more on the side, you just need to show that it still links back. If you're not sure if that's working, I would get someone else to read it and ask them if they can see the link, because sometimes you think the link is there, but it might not be there. All right, so the girls have picked one of your essays. So I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to read it. And what I like to get people to do as good practice, because I'd like you to practice this when you're writing your own and practicing your own, is something that's good about it and something that you would change or do to improve it. And then hopefully you're thinking about that in the back of your mind, and I'll give a bit of feedback on this as well. So yeah, I'll give you a couple of minutes, have a read, and then we'll have a bit of a chat about it. All right, it's okay if you haven't fully finished reading it, but hopefully you've gotten through enough to get the gist of it. All right. So when I look at a piece, I like to break it down, or I like to ask myself a few questions. So firstly, did this piece have a point, or did they have something to say? And the good thing is, I think, yes, they did. And some of the key things that this person had to say was that utilitarianism is a fundamental part of being human, and that humanness is very much if we're able to help as many people as we can. So this very humanitarian approach, which I like this because it's a little bit of a like different approach rather than just being like, this is what utilitarianism is. Do I think it's good or do I think it's bad? So definitely would encourage this kind of this kind of thinking where you ask yourself, what elements of this topic do I like to write about? So this person, I'd assume, likes to write about humanitarianism and like looking after other people, helping other people. So if that's something that whoever wrote this genuinely does like writing about, then that's great. If you don't like writing about it, then take an angle that you do enjoy would be my recommendation. So that's probably the first thing. The only thing is, and I think that this is probably just because what this person's done is tried to like put all their thoughts together in the smaller time span that we gave to complete the task. But this paragraph has a lot going on in it. So in here we've got, it starts out with utility and talking a little bit about it being an economic term, but there's no other mention of how it's actually an economic term, which is fine because then it starts talking about maximizing utility, which I guess can explain how it's economically related. But probably would like to see, if I was to see this as a completed essay rather than like a condensed one, as you guys were asked to do, I would like to see sort of a paragraph about maximizing utility and what that means, what that looks like, and then another paragraph about sort of that more humanitarian approach. So that's probably how I would break it up, because there's tons going on in here in terms of maximizing utility at the start, and then it goes, well, what about maximizing utility coming at the cost of others? And then that brings in that big humanitarian debate about, should we do something if it hurts others, even if more people are benefiting than people are being hurt? And so then what ends up happening is that there isn't a lot of room in this paragraph to develop on each idea, because there's like idea, idea, idea. And so what I would do is sort of split this up into talking about the benefits of maximizing utility, and then the second paragraph I'd go into more the costs of maximizing utility, and so the humanitarian side, what if it hurts people? And then that way each paragraph can sort of speak for itself and has the opportunity to put in really powerful either anecdotes or an example. So even things like the current coronavirus with the lockdowns, there's a lot of utilitarian debate around that, and some people are hurting more than others. So there's heaps of different examples you can use, and my recommendation would be to go away and spend some time doing some sort of idea generation to work. This is not so much my feedback for this essay, but just in general, my recommendation would be go away and do some idea generation about some like examples or ideas that you might like to put in your section 2 pieces. But what I really love is that this conclusion is really strong, and it brings back in that this person really believes that utilitarianism is all about humanitarianism and taking care of others and deciding, like looking at the benefits on other people. And so it really shows, I think a really great thing about this is the direction of the essay was really clear. It was from the start, it was going to be approaching this aspect of the topic. It wasn't going to be jumping around from political to economic to ethical to this to that. So that's an awesome part of this. I think obviously, like if in fact my recommendation would be to probably like take what whoever wrote this, take this and then just split this in half, this body paragraph that you wrote, and maybe spend 10-15 minutes turning it into 2 body paragraphs, and then you'd have a complete piece, and it'd be a great piece. So yeah, awesome job. And if that's one of your first times doing it, kudos to you, that's fantastic. Just a couple of questions in here. What do you think about adding rhetorical questions in an essay? Absolutely fine. You can add in whatever you find will help you to support your point. I think there's a lot of misnomers about that you have to follow a particular structure for this task, and there are a lot of things online that say, you know, if you follow this structure, you'll do really well. Whilst that might be true, this is your chance to put across your voice about the topic, and you can write in whatever style you like. So if you find it helpful to use rhetorical questions to make a statement or to make someone consider something or consider your point, go for it. What do you recommend we do to improve the complexity in an essay? How do you add depth? That's a really great one. I get asked this a lot. 2 things. One of them is practice. And with that, once you've practiced, look back at your essay and go, which parts here are a bit superficial? So, or which parts could be explored more, and then dive in a bit deeper to that. So that's the first one. The second one is, that I would recommend is in that idea generation exercise, when let's say that you decide, okay, I really like talking about mental health, then don't just say like, okay, I'm just going to learn a little bit about mental health, and then in your essay be like, mental health is important, here's how you can improve mental health. I dive a bit deeper and look at extra components of it. So how does it really affect people? What does it say about human nature? What does it say about human experience? How are people emotionally affected? How does it affect society on a broader spectrum? So looking at different elements of something can help you add depth and complexity. Are we allowed dictionaries? Best advice would be to read the ASA information booklet, but no, you're not allowed dictionaries. You're only allowed, an English to your first language translation if you're an ESL speaker. How many specific examples would you recommend in each essay? Highly varied. I wouldn't put more than 2 examples per paragraph. Also, your example can be anecdotal, so you can use personal experience. My recommendation for that would be link it back to a broader thing though. But it really does come down to practice and what you think works. And if you're not sure if it's working, get someone else to read it. And if they feel like there's too much crammed in, get them to tell you. And last one here, what about the use of examples that relate to the topic to support the argument, if that is the style? Sorry, I'm not sure what you mean by that. What about, yes, maybe if you just clarify what you mean by that, because yes, you're definitely able to use any example you like. My recommendation with examples, steer away from things that are really generic. So I wouldn't be writing about Hitler if something came up about war, because almost everyone else would feel like writing about that too. So write about, okay, no worries, it was answered in the question above. No worries. And so just steer away from more generic things. If you can only think about something generic, see if you can think of a different angle or maybe add a different argument to it to make it. No, that's okay, Sharon, all good. So I know that this is a section of the GAMSAT that brings up a lot of questions, and I think part of the reason why is because it's much more individual, and so it's not as rigid in terms of what you're required to do. So if you are confused or if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to send me an email. I'd be happy to guide you and help you out. And most of all, I would tell you to keep practicing. There's plenty of practice materials and resources out there, and we definitely provide a lot as well. But keep practicing, keep giving them a try, and getting people to help you out by reading what you've written and letting you know how they think you're going. That would be my sort of top recommendation with how to succeed in this section. And hopefully you can find it a really enjoyable section, because it's your chance to write something that you're a bit more passionate about than answering some science questions or answering some questions about poetry. So that would be my recommendation there. So I am now going to take a bit of a backseat and hand it over to Mish. He's one of our Section 3 tutors, and he will walk you through Section 3.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think based on the fact that it is getting quite late, I think it's better off if we just make a start straight away, especially because you guys are already quite focused already. So I will put the countdown on, and Eliza has sent the Section 3 questions through on the group chat. So I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to get ready, and then I will start the countdown. All right, let's go. Good luck. All right, time is up. We've got a few more responses trickling in. We've got about 15 now. So again, like Sarah had shown, this is kind of like what the distribution was for the for the section 3 scores. Obviously the average is on the lower side, but rest assured, I think it's still early days. So I'm sure with a bit of practice, a lot of you will find a lot of the questions become a lot familiar as you do kind of respond to them more with practice. And especially if it is the first time sitting it as well, it can be quite daunting and foreign for some people doing these types of questions. But similar to Sarah, I'm just going to take an approach on picking the questions that weren't answered the best. So just going through the questions that I have, I noticed that there are a few from the first unit as well as a few from the second unit that would be useful to cover. So I might just start off with question 2 and then move on to question 5. And then from unit 2, we'll cover question 1 and 2 and then see how we go for time. So again, it is quite difficult, especially with if, for example, you haven't covered electrical circuits before, to do that in your first sitting. But over time, as you kind of engage a lot more with any resources that you do have, and if you go to any other Halad Health kind of workshops or anything else in the future, you'll start to become more comfortable with things. So just starting off, let's just unpack unit 1 first of all. So we see unit 1 is primarily focused on vitamin D. And we notice that there's a large visual kind of diagram comprising of 3 graphs and 3 bar graphs as well at the bottom. And I think it's important to kind of already get into the mindset that there is a lot of visual information in this question that needs to be kind of analyzed and figure out what's essentially being kind of relayed to you when they provide this visual information. So starting off, let's just look at question 2. It wasn't answered very well. So question 2 was asking about an individual's vitamin D levels following 10 weeks of treatment. So when I look at this question, I first have to identify what part of this question stem is relevant to the question that's being asked. And we notice here that vitamin D3, which is also known as cholecalciferol, is labeled as blue in these diagrams. So immediately I'm already kind of narrowing, or in some ways, I'm narrowing my kind of focus onto the aspects of the graph or labeled blue in this instance. So we notice here it's asking about following 10 weeks of treatment. So again, I go back to this graph and I notice that the x-axis is present in the top 3 graphs. So I'm already, again, focusing here. And I notice that 10 weeks is essentially 70 days. So again, we would look at what parts of the question stem I can utilize in order to narrow my kind of field of analyzing the information. And it can really make you more efficient when it comes to answering these questions. So again, I would be looking at daily, 10 weeks, and vitamin D3. So here, daily, we notice is this graph here, 10 weeks of treatment is day 70. And I notice that the blue line is indicative of vitamin D3 treatment. So then I would look at where the 25 OHD levels are. And that's approximately 70. And I wrote this question because it can obviously trick some students and they can immediately go with, okay, well, they see a rise of 70-25 OHD after 10 weeks of treatment and immediately add 70 to 55. And that is why some students might go with 125. But the actual answer in this case was 85. And the reason being is that these participants in this study had actually started off with approximately a 40 nanomole level of 25 OHD. And with this in mind, you would actually have to consider the rise or the efficacy of this treatment in increasing 25 OHD levels within that period. So going from 70 to 40 is obviously 30 nanomoles per liter. So then you would simply be adding 30 nanomoles to 55, and your final answer would be B in this case. Okay, so that was question 2. And then we will be talking a bit about question 5 as well. So question 5 is a bit tricky as well, in that I've added an extra kind of statement or condition to this question that you guys have to consider. And it's involving the fact that 25 OHD rises by only half that of the amount of actual vitamin D in blood. So again, I'm already placing this in the back of my mind when I'm applying whatever rules to figure out the answer or option, the correct option in this case. So if we look at each of these options, in this case, it is quite difficult because there isn't anything to suggest one answer over another. So it is a case of simply going through each option and applying it to the data that's been provided. So if we start with question 5A, the individual is likely to only return to normal levels following 4 weeks of treatment if put on a bi-weekly dosing schedule. Again, I'm going to use that strategy of unpacking or kind of breaking down the option into fragments, which are a lot more easily identifiable in the graphs than if I were to look at the whole statement alone. So I'm looking at bi-weekly dosing schedule, 4 weeks of treatment, normal levels. So in this case, normal levels is referring to when the vitamin D blood levels are above 75. So we would go again to the graphs and we would look at 4 weeks after 4 weeks of treatment for vitamin D3. So again, we would be looking at the blue line. So if we look at bi-weekly, we notice that after 28 days, the level of 25 OHD is approximately 55. And in this case, we're actually starting at 35 nanomoles per liter of 25 OHD. So in this case, the rise would be approximately, doing quick maths here, 20 nanomoles per liter. So applying the rule that I mentioned before about 25 OHD rising by only half the amount of vitamin D in the blood, we would notice that the amount of vitamin D in the blood would actually increase by double, or in this case, 50. So if we add 50 to 30, it would be above 75 nanomoles per liter. So in this case, this statement is correct. I think we have made a mistake here. I think the answer wasn't supposed to be A, but if you guys did put A, I think in this case, it is right as well. But just, yeah, keep that in mind. Just the approach that I've taken when answering the question. So moving on to B, it is likely that the individual will present with an overdose before 2 weeks if put on a 4-weekly dosing schedule. I'm going to use the same approach that I did for the previous option. I'm going to underline the important kind of phrases within this option. So 2 weeks, 4-weekly dosing schedule, and then I'm going to go back to the initial diagram that I had provided. So if we go 2 weeks, 4-weekly dosing schedule, we notice that basically after 2 weeks, so after 14 days, we would have approximately 70 minus probably 40. So a 30 nanomole per liter increase of 25 OHD, applying the rule again of vitamin D doubling in relative to 25 OHD, we would notice that there would be 60 nanomole per liter rise of vitamin D alone. So adding 60 to 30, we get 90, and that would be classified as normal. An overdose is classified as when the blood level reaches 250 nanomoles per liter, which is obviously nowhere near the amount that this individual would be seeing after 2 weeks of treatment. So in this case, B is wrong. So before I continue, I just want to show how I've kind of approached this question with some kind of pattern or some kind of way of unpacking each option as well as the question itself. I've gone ahead and I've underlined key aspects of the question. And this is important because this way you're going to save time and be more efficient when it comes to figuring out which is the correct answer. Because I don't have to be going through and constantly referring back to the graphs and referring back to the options. As long as I know what parts of the graphs that I'm looking to, it just saves a lot of time when it comes to figuring out what's the right answer in this case. Finally, I'm just gonna do question C as well. Option C. An individual will reach normal levels of vitamin D by 2 weeks, irrespectively of the dosing schedule they are put on. So this is quite a difficult option because in this case, what they're expecting you to do is kind of look through each and every graph and the dosing schedule, because it's saying irrespectively of the dosing schedule, and see if it satisfies the criteria regarding normal levels, so above 75. So instead of looking and seeing, oh, does each graph satisfy this criteria, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take it a slightly different approach. What I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out, okay, to reach normal levels, I need to have vitamin D levels above 75. Okay, well, to get vitamin D levels above 75, I'm required for a 45 nanomole per liter increase of vitamin D. Okay, so needing a 45 nanomole per liter increase of vitamin D, that means that I will need approximately a 22 or 23 increase in 25 OHD levels, according to this statement here. So with that in mind, what I simply have to do is I have to look at after 2 weeks, so at 14 days for all of these graphs, and figure out if it increases the 25 OHD levels by more than approximately 22. I will go through the questions after I've finished this unit, sorry, and then I'll come back to them afterwards. So looking at each of these graphs, we can see that after 14 days, the rise, irrespectively of which treatment is provided and irrespectively of which dosing schedule is being provided, they all increase by more than 20 nanomoles per liter. So here, 40 to probably 15, so it would probably be around 30 in this case. And then here, approximately 25, and then here, approximately 25 as well. Yeah, approximately 25. So hopefully that kind of explains to you or gives you a more efficient approach to answering this question, or particularly looking at this option. Because I know that many students in this case might have gone ahead and just simply looked at each graph individually, and that would obviously be quite tedious and would cost you a lot of time that you could be spending on other questions in particular. So moving on from that, I might move on to Unit 2 and see what questions people had trouble with there. So it seems like people specifically had trouble with questions 1 and 2 in this case. So just discussing that, but before I do, I might just look at the chat and see if anyone had any questions. If C is right, isn't D also right? Okay, so if we just go back to question 3. Okay, so if we go back to that question for a second, someone's asking in regards to why option D is wrong. The individual will likely return to normal levels after a 2-week period if put on a daily dosing schedule. So the individual, again, I'm just going to run through my approach once more to kind of make it clear to everyone. normal levels, so above 75 after a 2-week period, if put on a daily dosing schedule. So with this question, let's just have a look. So here we notice that when we look at after 2 weeks on a daily dosing schedule, the rise is only approximately after 2 weeks, going from 40 to 55 nanomolar per liter. So that would be approximately 15 nanomole per liter increase in 25 OHD, which would equate to 30 nanomole per liter of vitamin D3 increase, which would mean that the levels of vitamin D would only go up to 60 nanomoles per liter. So with that in mind, it would not reach normal levels in this case. Yeah, I might just keep going and then I'll get to the questions in the chat if we do have time. But rest assured again that we will be providing work solutions for all of these questions for you. Okay, so moving on to the electrical circuit questions, let's just focus on questions 1 and 2 in the meantime. I am running quite short on time, so I will try and get through as much as I can. So if we look at question 1, or in this case, question 6, first of all, which adjustment could be made that would increase the current being measured by the ammeter? So unfortunately, in these kinds of cases, there is some difficulty in that there is some kind of assumed knowledge in regards to your familiarity with electrical circuits. So I will mention it as I go, but if you do feel like it is quite foreign to you, it might be recommended that you look into it a bit more. I'm sure there's all the physics textbooks that can provide information regarding it irrespectively. So let's just start with question 6. That would increase the current being measured by the ammeter. So my important point is current. So we're measuring current in this case. And current, the principle that we apply to current is that typically the current in an electrical circuit, i.e. that measured by an ammeter, is dependent on the voltage that's being provided, as well as the amount of total resistance which the electrons have to pass through. So with that in mind, what we're trying to do is basically, this question can be rewritten as which of the following adjustments would lead to the lowest overall resistance. So again, I'm just going to quickly go through and figure out what the options are and figure out why, which one is the correct option. I will start off by first saying that the answer is D. So let me just start with option A. So closing switch 1 only. So if we were to close switch 1, what essentially is happening is that the electrons or the current would be moving through from the battery that is providing 5 volts through this pathway here exclusively. And the reason for that is because when we close this switch, there's a rule or principle that current will always flow through the circuit of lowest resistance. So with this in mind, if we look at this circuit here, or this smaller circuit compared to this larger one here, current is likely to prefer to use this circuit here rather than this circuit, because it would mean that the current would only need to pass through 1 globe rather than 2 if it were to utilize this pathway instead. As a result, what we will see is that when we close switch 1, all of the current, instead of going through here, will instead just go through this smaller circuit here and only go through 1 globe. And the important point here is that we're trying to compare that to when only switch 2 is closed. So when switch 2 is closed, we notice that the only pathway it would likely take is one where it would go through and it would pass through 2 globes. So essentially, when we modify the circuit, close switch one only, we are passing through only one globe versus two if switch two is closed. Okay, so closing both switches, let's try that then. If we close both switch one and switch two, we notice that again, we follow that same principle that current prefers the pathway of lowest resistance. So by closing switch two, what is essentially happening is that there is no change that's going to be occurring to the pathway with which the electrons pass through. The reason being is that, like I mentioned before, and I will reiterate again, the pathway that has the lowest resistance is the one which electrons will prefer to take. So with that in mind, again, the electrons will start at the battery and flow through this smaller pathway here, irrespectively of this second pathway being available to them. So that's A and B are both correct, and that's why we get option D. Unfortunately, it seems I am running quite low on time, so I would just like focus on the questions in the chat. It seems like it's gone off quite a bit. Okay, so Jacob said, to clarify, we are meant to have gone through all that information you covered in the last 10 minutes within 2 minutes on the actual exam. Okay, so I don't think there's a hard and fast rule as to how much time you should allocate to each question. I know, for example, this recent exam, they provided approximately 2 hours to do 60 questions, which would mean essentially you have one question per 2 minutes. But just understand the idea or the concept behind that. The more practice you do, the more efficient you will become overall in terms of answering these questions. I don't think it's too important to kind of focus on timing at this point. It's just more about understanding the familiarity of these questions in particular. Was there highlighting, underlining for the recent online GAMSAT? Unfortunately not. I think what they did provide were 2 A4 pieces of paper, which you could kind of jot down any information that you did have, which can be quite useful in these kinds of situations. If you have things that you don't want to like refer back to when you're looking at a large question stem, but highlighting and underlining wasn't an option. Well, Say's already explained that. If C is right, isn't D also right? I think I've gone through that one. Yeah, I think that is obviously quite a daunting kind of part to section 3. I think especially for first time sitters, it can be quite overwhelming to see such large bodies of text or visual information being provided to you. But I think one tip that I would provide, and something that I kind of took when it came to answering these questions, was to really kind of unpack what the question stem is trying to tell you. So looking at graphs in particular and figuring out what they are suggesting, and then kind of when you're looking at the questions themselves, trying to tailor the question stem to what the question is asking can also be useful in kind of uncluttering that kind of large text or a lot of visual information in a short period of time. But I think that's all the time that I do have. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to get through all of your questions. Again, I will just mention that there will be answers provided, or work solutions in particular that will be provided for all of these questions. So feel free to use that as well. I'm happy to actually provide my email as well if need be. If you guys feel like you are not really understanding certain concepts. But outside of that, I think I might pass it on to Eliza to provide any final remarks, and then, yeah.
Thanks so much, Mish and Sarah. I think on behalf of everyone, everyone has done so well today, and just like getting through the end of that. And like I sort of said in the chat before, it doesn't matter what the score you got out was and what the predictive score got out was. Again, the sample size is very small right now, but also what matters is that you just had a try today and you got exposed to that and you had a learning lesson out of that. And that takes me on to my next slide. Mish, do you mind if I screen share now? Cool. Perfect. Cool stuff. All right. So at the end of every mini mock, we do this, and it's so important that we do this because one thing that we reiterate in all of our classes is the importance of reflective learning and out of that experience. So for everyone's, my internet connection is insane. For everyone's own learning and for the sake of keeping yourself accountable, I want you to think back to literally 2 hours ago and think, okay, what did I just learn in those 2 hours doing that mock exam? And if you can pop that learning and share it in the chat, that would be amazing. And whilst we go through that, as you can see, I've just let 3 links into the chat, and I'm going to go through that shortly whilst you pop those learnings in the chat. The first is just like, what is next from here? And I know Samuel, you just asked, how did you guys prepare for section 1, 2, 3? And there are definitely specific ways to do so for each. But first of all, I'd like to say, just if you have not yet, please join our Facebook community. It's a free open group, as well as a Facebook page. And basically this is where we put all of our free resources. We have masterclasses, and if you can't attend them live, we have the recordings up there. We have an 8-week GAMSAT challenge, which by the way is going live next Monday. So if you haven't signed up for that, do so now, because basically we just send you free questions every single week just to keep you accountable to actually doing consistent practice. And that is very much the key to all of our courses, is really consistency is what gets you to the end. And coming up, we have a lot of med skill things as well. The second link I've dropped is to our interactive calendar. Basically, it makes it real easy to see what's coming up and to put into your own schedule. As you can see in the screenshot that I've grabbed just there, there are a lot of free events. And then the last is just, if you're really getting serious about your GAMSAT study, I highly just encourage you to enroll in our 6-week intensives. These start on the 21st of July. They are 6 weeks. Basically, every week you have a dedicated 2-hour class online with the tutor. Sarah's a section 1 and 2 tutor, as well as Molly, and Mish is a section 3 tutor. And if you click on the link, there is literally a breakdown of week to week. And I think Jacob asked a good question of like, oh my God, there is like so much content. How do I sift through that? Like literally one of the weeks is like how to sift through what's relevant in the section 3 stems, because that's a really important skill. So we go through basically just like cut all the fluff and go into the content of what you really need to know skill wise for those exams. And as we've come through the May GAMSAT season already, we've seen incredible results from these 6-week intensives. And as you can see, like I think I've grabbed Previns, like section 2 rose by 20 points, just like absolute insane scores, and Previns just one of many. So I highly encourage you to check that out and enroll early, because most of the classes usually sell out within the first few weeks. So you want to grab your spot. Also, the classes are limited to 10 students per class. So there are also many times that you can pick. For you guys who have sat to the end of this, honestly, like I said, thank you, and so much respect for being able to like sit through all of that and doing that content on a night. So props to you guys. And for that, we just want to say thank you and provide a small, I guess, gesture of, someone else said in the chat room before, is everyone going to get their section 2 essay marked? We could only go through one live today, but if you use the promo code MINIMOCK1 when you purchase one of your 6-week intensives or a mock exam with the link I just provided before, we'll be able to mark and cross-mark your section 2 responses. You can write a full one and then we'll mark that one instead of your little thing that you did today and spend more time on it. But that is a terrific indication before you start your intensive of just like where you sit and what feedback to take on. So that is the end of our first mini mock. I hope to see everyone back again and with some insights from today to take away with, and just really hope that everyone got some value out of that. So thank you to Sarah, Mish, Molly and Vera for helping everyone today. And we'll see you guys soon. Stay safe.
Thanks for joining us, guys.